Our question today is, how should faiths exercise their public responsibility? In particular, from my perspective, how should Christian faith, how should Christians, rooted in their faith, exercise their public responsibility? Now, Christian faith has an inalienable public dimension. Christians aren't followers of Christ just in their private lives, not only in their communal lives either. They are Christ followers in their public and political lives as well. But many Christians think of the Christian faith as a private matter of heart and matter of private morality. To make it about matters of common life, about political matters of a city or of a nation, does not seem to fit to many Christians to the teaching of its founder. Now, Jesus Christ called blessed those who are meek, those who are pure of heart, those who are persecuted. He stooped down to wash his feet of his disciples. He often shied away from public attention, and he rebuked his followers for trying to use the sword being the classic symbol of political power, and he rebuked them from using the sword even to rescue him. And his message seems, frankly, too radical to apply to political life. Turn the other cheek, he says. Do not judge, he says. Love your enemies, he said. How could any of that possibly have something relevant to say to the rough and tumble, publicity-seeking, deal-making world of public life and of public engagement? On closer examination, however, Jesus' life and message are unmistakably public, even political, though they're not political in the usual sense of that term. After all, the core of Jesus' preaching is that the kingdom of God has come near. Now, whatever else it might be, kingdom is surely a political term. In line with the political character of the kingdom, the book of Revelation portrays the final actualization of God's reign as the holy city Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God to be established on earth. We get the word political from the Greek word for city that is used in that very verse, polis. But it's not just that Jesus' message had a public dimension. His mission was public. His mission was political as well. Now that may be controversial for some. The kingdom Christ proclaimed is inseparable from who he was during his ministry and crucifixion and who he continues to be after his resurrection. Jesus himself insisted on a close tie between him and the kingdom. As Jürgen Moltmann, my own theological teacher, has argued in The Crucified God, Jesus' way to the cross was a path of conflict with religious and political rulers of his day who saw his teaching, who saw his ministry, who saw his very life as a threat. From Herod's desperate attempt to kill the infant Christ to the Romans who crucified him for insurrection under the mocking sign, "This is the King of the Jews," the powers that be considered him a problem that they needed to deal with, violently deal with, if that need be. Expanding on Moltmann's thesis, Michael Welter, who teaches theology at the University of Heidelberg, has shown that Christ was crucified under the auspices of broad set of public institutions and agents, not just religion and politics, but law, for instance, and public opinion. Their role in the crucifixion reveals how susceptible to corruption these structures of human life can be, so that his very condemnation by them is a condemnation of those powers from the perspective of Christian faith. So this is the first part of the comments I want to make, just to make sure that we know how deeply public and political the Christian message is, but political, again, as we may discuss later, in a different sense that we usually take that term. My next point is to ask the question, how from Christian standpoint might we engage in public debates? And here I want to highlight the importance of civility. So the second topic is civility. Public role of faith is closely tied to a functioning of democracy. It's hard to have a public role of faith in other situations than democratic ones, as the case of Jesus exemplifies. He was crucified. As my own experience, I was raised in a communist society, exemplified as well. It was hard to have a public role unless you are in a democratic kind of setting. But at the same time, without public role of religions in a pluralistic world, democracies, contemporary democracies, will not be sufficiently democratic. So between democracy and the public role of faith, there is a mutual support, if you want. Over the past decades, we have witnessed an erosion of faith in democracy throughout the world. In Citizens Divided, Robert Post, my colleague in law school at Yale, argues that an essential step in restoring faith in democracy is, and I quote him, to encourage participation in public discourse so that persons may come to identify with the process of public opinion formation and consequently with the government itself. In a functioning democracy, people believe that government is potentially responsive to them and therefore identify with the government as their government. Democracies are therefore invested in the rights of individuals to speak in the public realm so that they can identify with government as their own. Now, in modern democracies, we often fundamentally disagree on profound issues. We disagree fiercely, and we disagree almost about everything. That's an observation of Ronald Dworkin, a philosopher, in his little book, Is Democracy Possible Here? He wrote those words in 2006 in the US. And then he noted, we disagree about terror and security, about social justice, about religion and in politics, who is fit to be a judge, and what democracy is. And then he notes, these are not civil disagreements. Each side has no respect for the other. We are no longer partners in self-government. Our politics are rather a form of war. Now, the state of America, and more broadly Western politics, has only deteriorated since that time. This was about 15 years ago that he said that. The purpose of Dworkin's book was not to complain, but to suggest a solution. And the subtitle of his book is Principles for a New Political Debate. And I think the two principles that he emphasizes was the first is the need for political argument. And I want to make that also plain here. This is the reason why I'm bringing it out. I believe that from the Christian standpoint, in the importance of the political argument, in deliberative, if you want, democracy. Dworkin sets the goal as follows. We need to find ways not merely to struggle against one another about divisive issues, as if politics were contact sport, but to argue about them from deeper principles of personal and political morality that we can all embrace. then the question becomes, well, what are those principles? And then Dworkin emphasizes two, and I want to highlight those two, and I'll return back to them at the very end of my comment. First, these principles, first principle says that each human life is intrinsically and equally valuable. Each human life intrinsically and equally valuable. And second, that each person has an inalienable personal responsibility for identifying and realizing value of his or her own life. Let me repeat that last one because I think it's really important. That each person has an inalienable personal responsibility for identifying and realizing value of his or her own life. That's basically, the first one is about freedom of religion, and the second one is about freedom of religion, and the first one is about equality. But important for Dworkin is also the second component of the solution. So the first component is, in order to have the public arguments, you have to affirm equality, and you have to affirm the right of each individual to direct their own life. But the second component of solution is that what he calls mutual respect. And then he explains, for argument is pointless without faith in those with whom you argue. To have faith in people with whom you argue in politics, it is not just to have confidence that they will be responsive to argument. More importantly, it is to have faith in their attachment to dignity of all human beings, in their deep commitment to respect one another. Now, they may not manifest that always in behavior, but that has to be fundamental stance. And now, the important question, I think, an important contribution of Christian faith to discussion, not just Christian faith, but certainly Christian faith as well, is to reflect on what does respect actually mean? And how does one nurture respect? What does respect mean? How might it be possible to respect persons with whom we strenuously disagree, or whose behavior we find morally abhorrent? Now that's the question, right? How do you respect somebody with whom you not just strenuously disagree, but actually find their behavior morally abhorrent? That's the situation we are in pluralistic setting, and I think that's the answer that we need to find. Now, German philosopher Immanuel Kant, whose work lies at the foundation of at least Western thinking about human dignity, insisted famously that all human beings have equal dignity, and therefore deserve equal respect, equal dignity, and because they're capable of directing their lives guided by rational principles. Notice, capable of directing lives by rational principles, not always directing their lives by rational principles. Capability is central, not the actuality of realization of that capability. Kant did not mean, as I just said, that all human beings have dignity because they actually make rational moral choices. Instead, they have dignity because of their capacity to do so. For him, therefore, the worst human being, in any respect you can possibly name, the worst human being has the same dignity or absolute worth as the best rational being in that respect or in any other respect. That's a kind of radical position that he has taken. I believe that behind Immanuel Kant's position, which I think is roughly right, though I would think of human dignity slightly in different terms than he does, but behind Immanuel Kant stands Martin Luther, the great Protestant reformer. He distinguished between work, what he called work, and person, or between what we do, how we think and how we act, and who we are as human beings. Even when how people act doesn't deserve our respect, even when we rightly withhold giving them what some philosophers is called appraisal respect, we still owe them recognition respect. The distinction that a Yale professor of moral philosophy has introduced between appraisal respect and recognition respect. I judge, I appraise how they behave as not worthy of respect, but nonetheless, I recognize them as human beings that are worthy and that demand of respect and that demand my respect. Now, that distinction is fundamental, I think, for nurturing respect in a situation in which we profoundly disagree. And that distinction, I think, goes through Kant, back straight to Martin Luther, back straight, I would want to argue, to the Apostle Paul. That's not to say that from other traditions you can develop similar positions, but I'm sketching what's at the root of the Christian account of these things. We respect them as human beings, as bearers of God, God's image, and civility in public discourse depends on that kind of recognition. So my second point and third point that I want to make is that the culture of respect, I spoke about culture of respect. First I spoke about engagement, and then engagement requiring a certain culture of respect, but culture of respect itself is not sufficient. What one needs also is something like arrangements, political arrangements that embody that respect. We need political arrangements that express and sustain mutual respect. If we agree that in addition to culture of respect, we need arrangements of respect, two options, I think, are largely close to us, though they continue to inspire imagination of men. One option that's not open to us is exclusion of religion from the public space. And in many secularist secularizing kinds of regimes, there's a sense that you've got to exclude religions from public sphere. If you let them into public sphere, they can't rationally talk to one another. Their heads are going to clash, and then we're going to have a social problem on our hands. And so the idea of exclusion of religion is to kind of secure a public peace. That's at least the justification that is sometimes given. The other option that's not open for us is the saturation of public space by a single religion or single secular ideology. Either of these options, either of exclusion of religion from public space or saturation of public space by a single religion, both of these options include not just disregard of others, but have oppressive consequences. So in order to avoid these two options, we need something like a pluralistic democracy. Foundation of the pluralistic democracy, I believe, is to be found in the two principles that I have mentioned earlier that ought to guide the way in which we approach organizing structures of society. And these two central key features are freedom of religion, which I think is the most fundamental one, and at the same time combined with affirmation of equality of persons and therefore equality of their voice. Let me just say a few words about freedom of religion, and then I will end. I have exactly 1 minute left. Some people talk about freedom of religion as the fundamental right that lies at the foundation of all of human rights, all human freedoms. And in many ways, I agree with that position. And I want to expand it to mean not just freedom of religion, but freedom of orientation of the self toward the goal of one's life. That kind of sense of me being responsible for my own existence in its entirety is fundamental, I believe, to being human. Nobody can be born instead of me. Nobody can die instead of me. Nobody can direct my life instead of me. I am responsible for that. No matter how the influences come at me, how I come to decide which direction of life I ought to take. No, independent of any of the influences. And through all the influences, it is still I who decide about the direction of my life. And that's why freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, more broadly, depends so profoundly, and it's at the core of what we as human beings are. There would never be Jesus were they not for standing against the suppression of the freedom and speaking out. There would never be Muhammad. There would never be great founders of religious tradition if there weren't for them asserting what was contested, namely freedom to be otherwise that other people thought was necessary to be. That is our fundamental freedom, and I think that freedom is a ground for why we ought to, for us, claim it for us, but also respect it in others and grant, in addition to that, equal worth to each human being. You have that. You may have different arrangements, political arrangements of respect. You have that. You will have culture of respect. And you have that, I think, if you have a Christ kind of commitment to bringing the kingdom of God, rule of the one God of all people, to this earth. Thank you very much.
So we are supposedly the most religiously diverse society in the world. And I want to begin with this point because in Singapore, among other things, even though we are extremely religiously diverse, we also have reinforced cleavages between race and religion. So what happens is that you've got race as one cleavage, as one category, and you've got religion as another category. And political theory, basically, Aaron Liphart would tell you that it would be good in societies, pluralistic societies, to have what you call cross-cutting cleavages. In other words, you don't want them to be reinforced. You don't want to be a minority. You don't want to be a minority and also belonging to the same religion and also poor and also, you know, the disadvantaged in many other ways. So you don't want reinforced cleavages. You want cross-cutting cleavages. The situation in Singapore is that we have, in these two cleavages, race and religion, reinforced cleavages in some respects. Now, for those of you who don't live in Singapore generally or don't know that much about the demographics of Singapore, I'll just go through some statistics to give you an idea. Singapore, as we all know, is predominantly Chinese society. We have between 75–76% ethnically Chinese, about 13% Malays, Indians, which include everyone from the sort of Indian subcontinent, including Sri Lanka and so on, would be about 8.5–9%, and a remainder 3% of so-called others. Right? That's the racial dimension. So Singapore is very unique in this part of the world in the sense that you are essentially, or we are essentially, a Chinese city amidst a Malay-Muslim world. That's the first fact that we should note. The second is that there is some coincidence between the racial categories and the religious categories. So if you look at the distribution of religions, the religion that has supposedly the most numbers would be Buddhism / Taoism. That would command something like 43.2% of the population. Next come the Christians with almost 19%, 18.8%. Muslims 14.7%, Hindus 5%, and 18.5% so-called others, which would be other faiths as well as those who don't profess a particular faith. Right? If you put these two charts together, then what you see is that among the Chinese, you would have 43.2% Buddhists, 12.9% Taoists, and 20.9% Christian. So in a sense, among the Chinese, the religions are quite spread out generally across different faiths. Very few Muslims. There are some Chinese Muslims, but not that many. And there are a few Chinese Hindus as well. But I think the numbers are too negligible for them to capture in the demographics. Then you've got the Malay community, where you've got 99% of Malays who are also Muslims. There's 1% who either have no faith or have converted to other religions, but 99%. So you could almost say, right, all Malays are Muslims. You could almost say that, right? And then when you look at the Indian community, which is the third largest sort of community ethnically in Singapore, you would have about 60% of them who are Hindus, and 21% of them who are Muslim, and then another 13% who are Christians, and then mix of others. So what you then get in this dynamic, in this pluralistic society, is that you have race and religion that tends to divide the society in this kind of pluralistic way, which sometimes makes it difficult, right? Because it's very hard sometimes to separate an argument that's based on ethnicity with one that's based on religion, and sometimes it gets conflated together. The other problem, of course, is that I'm giving you these rough statistics based on what the Department of Statistics in Singapore classifies as people being Chinese and so on. The reality now is that actually mixed marriages are much on the rise. I think about 30% of the marriages contracted or registered at the Registry of Marriages are of mixed marriages. So eventually, I think in my lifetime, probably, pure Chinese, Indian, Malay, you're not going to have that many pure ethnic of those particular groups. So you got that dynamic. Now, this dynamic, believe it or not, has existed in Singapore more or less unchanged since about 1901. If you look at the population statistics going back to 1901, your population figures have shifted very little, at most by 3 percentage points. One way or the other, less Chinese, more Malays, it goes up and down, but no more than 3 percentage points, more or less. So that tells you something about Singapore, that we have always been pluralistic. So what is the approach to the dealing of such a pluralistic society? How do you deal with it in terms of management of religion? Historically, the British were actually quite laissez-faire about religions. They were quite content to allow the various faiths to preach their religions among whoever, as long as you didn't interrupt with British and with trade. So that's why in Singapore, and this we kind of take for granted in Singapore, but many of my friends from overseas come and they find it quite startling that you can walk down the same street and you see a Muslim mosque right next to a Hindu temple, right next to a Buddhist temple, right cheek by jowl by each other. I very often like to take people down to Waterloo Street, Queen Street Temple. There's the big Kuan Yin temple, and there's an Indian temple next to it. And it's really quite interesting if you stand outside and watch, because you find Chinese devotees first going into the Kuan Yin temple, pray, and then they come out, and then they just like have to cover the places. They also pray to the Hindu gods in the Hindu temple. And the same thing, the Hindu worshippers come out and they also kind of like, maybe this is Singaporean, you just kind of want to cover your bases with asking for blessings, right? But this is something that we kind of take for granted, largely because in the early part of our history, the British were quite happy to leave well alone, and they were quite happy to leave and to give land grants to temples, churches, and so on, living right next to each other. There was really no big issue. Issue began to arise in the 20th century when it became a public order problem. Public order problems arose from a number of things. Started off with religious processions, right? Too much noise, too many people, right? So when you have too many people congregate for a religious ceremony and so on, it presents the British with a particular threat to the social order, a particular political threat. So this is when they began to legislate. They legislated it in several ways. They had the Societies Act, among other things. They also inserted into the penal code a number of provisions where you wanted to safeguard religious feelings. And this is something that is quite interesting in Singapore, right? How is it that you can protect people's feelings from being insulted? If you look at section 298 of the penal code, it actually talks about it is an offense for you to actually deliberately or intentionally wound religious or racial feelings. Okay? 298A, which was added on later, is if you promote enmity between different races and religious groups, among other things, wounding them by wounding their feelings with enmity, hatred, and ill will, that's also an offense. So we treated this as a public order issue. There's nothing to do with which religion. Didn't talk about Christians. British were mainly Christians. It didn't talk about Christians. Didn't talk about Muslims. It just talked about any race. Why? Because it's a public order issue. It is something that you wanted to be sure that, you know, if you wanted trading to go on, you wanted business to go on, you didn't want trouble in the public space. So this is the way it was regulated. Of course, subsequently, more and more regulations came in, which caused both the colonial government and subsequently the post-independence PAP government to be very wary about these things. I will highlight three main events that sort of get seared into our consciousness in relation to religious relationships. The first one, which people seldom talk about, was the Sepoy Mutiny of 1915, where a group of disgruntled Sepoys, who were mainly Muslims, were stuck in Singapore. They were supposed to be shipped back to India, and then suddenly they were told that they might have to be redeployed elsewhere. Now, actually, the plan was still unclear where they were supposed to go. It could have been to Sri Lanka, but a radical guy from the Garda movement in Singapore began spreading rumors that they were going to be shipped to Turkey to fight their Muslim brothers. And that's when the riot started, right? And of course, there were more and more rumors that came out. Oh, you know, the grease that they were using for their guns was made of pig, what do you call it, lard, and so on and so forth. So this was what started the riot. In the end, of course, with the help of the military, the riot was quelled, and the mutineers were shot in front of Outram prison, which is where Outram MRT station is now, and publicly. Right? This is the last public execution that took place in 1915. Then later on, you had something that we talk about all the time, right? Whenever we talk about the dangers of racial extremism, the Maria Hertog riots. Maria Hertog, as some of you might know, was actually a Dutch girl born of Dutch parents, but during the war, she was left in the care of a Muslim woman who then raised her as a Muslim child and converted her to Islam. After the war, the Dutch parents came looking for her, and they ended up finding her in Singapore and tried to claim her back. And then, of course, this was fanned by a number of elements. Of course, the extremists were very, very concerned that they wanted to politicize the issue, to hit back at the British, and they began to spread rumors about the way Maria, or Nadra, which was her Muslim name, was treated. The British judge very unwisely had sent her to a Catholic convent for sort of temporary, as a safe haven while they battled over her custody. I mean, this is really not a very clever thing to do. But this was capitalized on by a number of people, and this was actually out there. I've been trying to find this picture, but this is fictitious because it doesn't exist. They said, they even had her kneeling at the foot of a statue of the Virgin Mary. This was what everyone was talking about. trust me, I looked at every newspaper. I cannot find such a picture. There never was such a picture. But you drum this up. You can create and get people very, very upset by these kinds of shows of insensitivity. And then the other one, of course, that we often talk about is 1964 Prophet Muhammad riots, right, which took place during the time when we were a part of Malaysia. So these issues, public law, public order issues, but also issues that were felt, that were thought to have been possible to control, had the state been much more interventionist. In other words, it's no use having this in your penal code and all that, because that's ex post facto. You've already committed a crime, then I lock you up. That's okay, but that doesn't solve the problem. It does not preempt a problem from erupting. You don't want a big riot to have broken up and then you start arresting people. You want to prevent the riot from actually occurring in the first place. So this was when you began to see the government being much more interventionist in this. And we've seen this from day one when Singapore became independent. Singapore realized the problem when we were part of Malaysia already, right? You could see certain moves. When we were part of Malaysia, the Malaysian constitution states in an exclusive kind of way that the official religion is Islam. But of course, Singapore had no problem accepting that, because under the state-federal relationship, religion was a state matter, not a federal matter. So Singapore could decide whatever it wanted to do in relation to religion. So we didn't have a problem with Article 3 of the Malaysian Constitution. But already you can see that this is extremely divisive, and the state decided that it had to intervene. How did we intervene? Well, Lee Kuan Yew, who was Prime Minister for a very long time, was a lawyer. So he thought, well, let's use the law, right? So he convened a constitutional commission headed by the Chief Justice, Wee Chong Jin. And what they did was they proposed, among other things, something called a Council of State. The idea had been taken from the Kenyan Constitution. And the idea here was that you have a sort of a council of elders who were respectable, moderate people who could advise the government on issues relating to discrimination, in particular minorities, racial, linguistic, and religious minorities. Just focus on these three things: race, religion, and language. So that's why our pledge, Ben was talking about the pledge, right? Regardless of race, language, or religion. But these were the three things that we were particularly concerned with. And so eventually what came about in 1969 was something called the Presidential Council for Minority Rights, where, among other things, it is supposed to report on legislation that may have what they call a differentiating effect, a differentiating measure. In other words, a discriminatory measure against any racial, linguistic, or religious minority. Some people think that this is a paper tiger. David Marshall quit the Presidential Council because he thought, oh, this is really a toothless tiger, because you can only raise a flag if you thought that something was wrong. And ever since its formation till now, the Presidential Council for Minority Rights has never issued a negative comment on any particular legislation. Now, of course, you could say, you see, you're useless, right? But I think we have to be a little bit more rigorous than that. So actually, I did try to do a search to see if indeed there should have been legislation that was flagged, that should have been flagged, but was not flagged. And honestly, I could find only one subsidiary legislation which may be a problem, right? And those of you who live in HDB flats will know this very well. This is the racial integration policy, where you have quotas of people living in particular flats. So a block of flats, you can have no more than 25% Malays, for example, no more than 80% Chinese, and so on and so forth. That's the only thing I thought that potentially violated Article 12 of the Constitution, which was not highlighted by the Council. Otherwise, I think they did what they did quite well. So when you have intervention by the state, what happens then is that the state regulates the space very tightly. It tries to intervene before things blow up. And the Singapore state is extremely interventionist in that sense, and they make no apologies for that. So, for example, I'll give you one example, the call to prayer, the Muslim call for prayer. At one time, it was fairly laissez-faire, and they allowed them to install loudspeakers in all the mosques. In the past, there was no electricity, there was no microphones and so on, so you would actually use the human voice, but you could amplify this. If you did this at 5 a.m. in the morning, of course, it's a problem, right? Because you wake people up and so on. So there were complaints. So they began to scale back. The government did this in sort of incremental manner. So first, they didn't ban it outright. They said, okay, you can have your loudspeakers, but you must turn them inwards. You don't turn them outside. So you turn them inwards first, right? Then after a while, they said, well, you don't really need that, right? Call for prayer. I tell you what, we'll allocate a special radio frequency for the call to prayer. So Muslims, you just turn on to that frequency, and in the morning, like an alarm clock, the call to prayer will come out, and you don't need these microphones. And finally, they dismantle all the loudspeakers. So this is the way the state intervenes and deals with this problem. Give you one more example. A few years ago, there was a primary school, a principal of a this is called I'm trying to remember the name of the school, Boon Lay Gardens Primary School, where she decided that the school would have a halal zone. The school would be a halal zone, which meant that there would be only halal food available for students during recess. And the parents were very upset with this. Many of the students were Chinese students, and in fact, it became known as the Bao story, right? Ban said, how can my children not have their Bao, right? So this became a big issue. And again, the government intervened. Now, this is not by way of legislation or prosecuting anybody. They called up the teacher, they had a chat, they called up the principal, and the principal said, yeah, that was a wrong move, reverse the policy. So there's a lot of soft touch involved in this intervention of the state. And I can tell you many more stories about the way in which the state does this. Sometimes a little bit more aggressively, especially if you were a religious leader. Okay? What are the problems? And I will leave you there. My time is almost up, or is up. You regulate public space, that's fine. But what are the presumptions of the state? What do we assume that the state is doing when you ask the state to regulate? Now, we have been quite lucky because the state is actually extremely sensitive to these matters, and so they don't side with any particular religion. They try to keep the public space safe so that you can have at least some modicum of discourse. So that begs the question, what if the government decides to be partisan? What if it decides not to be neutral? Then if you allow the state to command that much of space or to regulate that space in that way, then what if you get a rogue state? What if people go crazy? That's first question. Secondly, if you regulate this space, it's a little bit like trying to make playgrounds too safe. Right? And people forget how to fall down, you break their heads. Because you don't fall often enough. You don't know how to take the bruises and tumble and roll with the falls and punches and so on. So how do we regulate? Is our society going to be less mature because of that? Because sometimes when something happens, the society itself is unable to respond. And what you're doing is you're looking to the government, hey, why didn't you do something about this? And this is what we always end up doing, we call government and complain, right? And so that says something about the political maturity of the state as well. So there are pluses and minuses in this case. Last point. On what basis do you intervene? Is it purely majoritarian? In other words, do we go with the majority? Do we do it because the majority wants it? Or do we do it because it's a matter of principle? Are we prepared to do something which the majority don't want, for example? Right? And this is where sometimes it's very hard to make a stance. But these are questions which continue to plague us, and I will leave you with that and then hopefully take some questions. Thank you very much.
Right. Good evening, everyone. I think you've heard two very thought-provoking remarks. And before we go into the Q&A and comments, I thought it'd be useful for me to engage Miroslav and Kevin. And I want us to begin with the whole idea that religion in the private sphere is not something that in Singapore we think much about. Right? In fact, we take the view that religion does have a role to play in the public square. Right? Why should religious perspectives be treated differently from non-religious perspectives? But I want to ask both Miroslav and Kevin, right? The title for today's Veritas Forum, right, is Faith in a Pluralistic Society. I want you to try to engage with all of us. Do you think there's a difference between faith and religion? Right? Okay? And when we talk about pluralism, obviously in a forum like this, we think of different faiths, right? We think of different religions. But I also want to share with the audience whether you think there are what other dimensions of pluralism are there in most societies today? Okay, so two questions to kick us off. Miroslav?
Yes. Let me take the second question first. There are other dimensions of pluralism, and I'm not sure how is the case in Singapore, but in many countries, especially Western countries, but not just Western countries, there is a very robust and not unified vision of something like secularism, secular humanism. There are kind of sets of arguments within the broadly secular humanist camp, and I think we need to make sure that those of us who come from religious kinds of perspectives to make sure that there is a space also for a considered kind of secularism. And so those debates between religions and our religions are significant. I think we shouldn't forget also internal debates within the religious tradition. There are sometimes fissures that run deeper within a given religion. In the United States, for instance, you can see in Christian circles that you have deeper divisions between those who are left and right than you might have between right and right on the Muslim side of things. So the alliances end up being cross-cutting the religious differences in important ways. I think that's in a sense as it ought to be. Religions are differentiated kinds of phenomena, and it can be also helpful. And maybe comment also about the distinction between faith and religion. There's a kind of a big debate in social sciences, but in theology as well, is whether a certain kind of personal investment in religion makes you less able to be pluralistic. So sometimes the theory is the more religious or more faith infuses your religiosity, the less pluralistic you are going to be. And so religion ends up being this kind of attenuated form of belonging to a particular group, often as some people can experience that, religion ends up then being simply as a marker of identity. It's like a flag. It tells you to whom you belong. I always give example from my own country and the war in the former Yugoslavia that was along the lines, the religious lines within Christianity, Orthodox and Catholic. And you had this famous picture of the fighters on the tank, riding on the tank and flashing a sign like this. Now, you may say that this may be kind of a botched victory sign with the thumb sticking out where it should be like this, but actually it isn't. This is the sign that was meant. Now, this sign is the stretched out fingers actually are also symbol of the way in which Orthodox people, Orthodox believers, cross themselves. And they cross themselves with 3 fingers together like this, and 2 like this, and then make the sign of the cross. 3 fingers are 3 persons of the Holy Trinity. 2 fingers are the 2 natures of Jesus Christ. And they come into one when you make the sign of the cross. On the cross, the Trinity and 2 natures of Christ belong together, and they're appropriated to you. That's what's behind this sign, right? Now, you see, this is a very sophisticated, elaborate, existentially, deeply committed account of what this sign means. Now, when the fighter sits on a tank and flashes this sign, does any of that come to his mind? I very much doubt it. That sign means this is us, as opposed to barbarian Catholics who cross themselves with just hand like this, right? That's how the crossing ends up happening. And so religion then is simply a flag, a symbol that we're different than they are. My theory is actually that the more religion functions as simply a symbol of identity, the more violent it can become. And the more non-pluralistic it can become. Because it doesn't have internal moral commitments that are part and parcel of religious convictions to temper the adversities that are created when groups with distinct sense of belongings clash over whatever issues the groups may be clashing. So I want to say that more we infuse religion in this sense that I've just described with actual faith, the more likely we're going to be able to have a genuine pluralism while respecting differences.
Okay, I think my answer is, I am not a philosopher nor theologian, so trying to distinguish between faith and religion may take me all night. So I'm going to try and put it this way. I see religion as organized religion, as a self-identity. So you call yourself a Christian, you're a Christian. If you're a Muslim, you're a Muslim. Faith is slightly different. I think faith is larger than that. Faith can attach to a religion, and faith can also be attached to having no religion, right? And so when we talk about faith in the public square, faith in the public, in a pluralistic society, I think we need to cover the entire gamut. It's not only those who profess a particular religion, or even an established religion. I mean, who's to say that you can't have a new religion emerge tomorrow? I used to play this game with my students very often, and I said, you know, how is religion defined in the Constitution? And they always have this problem. And I say, well, what if I start a new religion tomorrow, right? Let's just call it the, you know, let's worship the dean. Religion, right? And who's to say that's not a new religion? And then someone invariably will say, but the dean is not God. And my answer is, do you know that? Of course, this is all being very facetious, but there's a point to this, right? The point here is that I think in a secular discussion, it's very hard for us to try and define religion because it is of so many varieties. And we mustn't forget that freedom of religion also means freedom from religion. In other words, if somebody chooses not to profess a faith or to change his or her faith, that must also be available in the public space. And this is the way I look at it. And as far as alternatives, yes, I think your main alternative would be laissez-faire. I mean, excise all religion from the public space. Ban crosses from public buildings and any form of garments that show your identity or your religious identity. But that's totally unrealistic. It's totally unrealistic. Not in a
Progressive too. Not just unrealistic. It's morally bad.
Yeah. Well, I'm just a lawyer.
And I'm a lawyer too. But
all the burden of morality on me.
Yeah, we play by the rules, and you tell us about the ethics. I mean, the question I raise is because I think very often, I think Miroslav is certainly right when he says that religion is very much an identity mark, right? Or at least for some of us, we tend to focus on we belong to this particular grouping. This is our flag. But I also want you to think about, this particular point, that the best of faith can defeat the worst of religion. And I think, again, Miroslav makes a point about, that personal investment, right? So you can have a plural society, right? So we can have in Singapore, many other societies, many different faiths, right? But a plural society doesn't guarantee you, that pluralism. Right? It doesn't guarantee that the different groups will not only coexist, because coexist is not enough, but that they'll be able to engage. And this is where I want to lead to my other question, right? So Miroslav, you're a big fan of, at least you make a point about human flourishing. And I just want, you and Kevin, to reflect on whether, does religious worldviews offer something different, from a non-religious worldview with regard to human flourishing? Or, would these worldviews actually not mean much in the end? That human flourishing, whether you're taking it from a religious perspective or not, there are commonalities. So, gentlemen? Kevin?
Wow. First of all, you have to read Miroslav's book, Flourishing. It's a great book. Seriously, I read it, and I told Miroslav over dinner just now that I must say that there's very little I could disagree with in the book, except for one thing. And maybe that's because of his perspective. It comes from a very normative perspective about the human being. I'm a realist, and I deal with crazy people sometimes. And the reality is this, and I can fully understand. And here is probably the duality of human nature. We always reside in our higher selves and our lower selves. We know what is right, but we don't always do what is right. We know what we should do. Sometimes, our faith requires us to do certain things that that, well, unfortunately, as a human being, you find it sometimes difficult to do, right? And this is where I don't know how we can tap into that higher egregore, how we tap into that spiritual value that will make that kind of discourse in pluralistic society constructive, right? Because the reality is that it very often isn't. How do you ensure that people flourish? How do you ensure that people always talk in their better selves? I don't know how to make that happen. You can, unfortunately, and you can, with the best efforts, try. But if the other party is intent on destroying that conversation, or just simply insisting that there is just one way, or that way is their way or the highway, then no kind of dialogue is possible. And then we end up being tribes again.
I agree with everything. And I want to even heighten this kind of sense of our incapacity, of the difficulty that we have. And it's not just that I have difficulty with others, I've got difficulty with myself every morning, every day, every hour of the day. Is how does one internally orient oneself so as to grow into our best selves? That, I think, is a fundamental question for each one of us. And it's also an important question more publicly. Your question was also about, I'll put it in my terms, do somehow religious perspectives on the good life or the flourishing life, truly meaningful life, have some advantage over against, or maybe not advantage, qualitative difference than kind of secular, non-religious perspective. And it's, so I generally tend not to like to kind of play one religion against the other in terms of things. I like to emphasize not so much. Let me back up. There are two ways, very simply put, the complicated issue put very simply. There are two ways to define identity. One is to concentrate on the boundaries and say, aha, this is where the difference lies. This is not in, and this is in. The other way to define identity is from orientation toward the center. I am, say, a Christian, not because I'm distinct from whoever, but because I'm oriented toward Christ. And then distinction will end up taking care of themselves, right? I don't worry so much about distinctions. I worry about commitment to the core, right? And that's a very different way of dealing with this. You know, there's a story, apparently, one of the very early Christian critics his name was Celsus. And the church father Origen was responding to Celsus. And there's a line in Celsus' critique of Christianity which I think remained true through the centuries and even today. Celsus, exaggerating because he's a critic, right, said, Christians like to be so much different from the rest of the world so that if the whole world became Christian, they would be something else. That's defining identity through difference, right? You see, and it ends up being adversarial to begin with. So that's a little bit longer introduction to the idea of what might be some specific features of religious traditions that I might want to highlight without necessarily critique of others. And to me, it's very simple, and it's when Jesus was tempted. First temptation was after having not eaten for 40 days. There are these stones here. Make these stones into bread. And Jesus' response was, human being, famished, 40 days not eating. Human being does not live by bread alone. Now, I think that's really the fundamental conviction of the Christian faith, fundamental conviction of Judaism, fundamental conviction, I believe also of Islam, other great religious traditions, that there is this transcendent realm. We all quarrel about how to understand transcendent realm in a different way, but that there is this transcendent realm that is of such fundamental importance that we don't live by material reality. That's over against, I don't want to name it as a philosophy so much as practice in today's world, where major institutions of our life, social institutions, cultural institutions, are all oriented in creating more bread. All oriented creating better bread, more sophisticated bread that I have than you have, and that I feel better about myself, not because I have nutritional value is higher of this thing, but because I have something cool that you don't have. And the entirety of our educational system, our political system, the state becomes a market state, economic system, of course, entertainment system, they're all oriented about multiplying bread, and we're all hungry all the time. contentment may be a worse side of the importance of the stress on transcendence. And we have no idea how to think of contentment today. I'll stop with this. After I make this comment, once I was putting stuff on Facebook and Twitter, and once I said something praising contentment. I have never received as much abuse on Facebook. Not when I wrote about Trump, not about whatever I write. Then praising content. How can you say contentment? How can you be content? Are you going to stop progressing? Are you going to? So we have made. We complain that we are not satisfied, but we have made the malcontentment to be the principle of our life. And I think it's tied with the idea more breadth, more breadth, more breadth, rather than emphasis on transcendence.
I think on that note, I hope that gets you, sufficiently engaged. The questions are coming in. So I just want to turn to the Q&A. The content moderators, if I can call them that way, have said that you could ask questions in person, right? But I think we have provided this option. So I just want to begin with, this question about whether there are limits to respect. I think Miroslav, that's something that you raised. And essentially the point is, are there limits to mutual respect in public discourse? Particularly when there are, what the question says, clear power asymmetries marked by class, race and gender, right? Or to put that dimension to that question, right? How do you find meaningful conversation, given that extremists tend to speak louder than so how do we deal? Are there limits to respect? Are there limits to public discourse? Where people disagree with you fundamentally, the methods they may want to adopt are something that you disagree with, or do we pretend, that public discourse is still possible, and that there is room for these two sets of people to engage with?
I think we distinguish these two types of respect that I described: appraisal respect and recognition respect. And we can maybe use different terms also for that. One is respect for the person, and the other is the respect for what they do and how they think, right? And that's a very difficult distinction to make. Many people would say, I'm not interested in making that distinction. That distinction is not plausible as a distinction. And I understand that debate. I've had these kinds of discussions with many of my friends. And in some ways, it really depends on the fundamental convictions of another person having inherent dignity on account of being created in the image of God. So we can have debates on that. But if you can work with that distinction, then I think we can think of somebody's behavior as being abhorrent, somebody's behavior needing to be stopped, in fact, while at the same time, or just because we respect them as person. In other words, respect as a person in no way excludes forms of discipline, forms of pushback of various types. I think you mentioned two sets of folks who present the problem. One set of folks is extremists, right, whose voices are shrill, and sometimes extremism is manipulated in order to divert the public debate, and that's one of the central, I think, practical issues with which we have to deal today, especially in the context of social media. The other comments was about kind of fundamental differences in power that people have in the public debates. I think that's a very serious issue that needs to be addressed, and I think there is a deep Christian commitment to listen first to the weak. It doesn't mean that the weak have the last word. It simply means that powerful have also powerful means to make their message not just articulated, but they make their message plausible, make their message stick, whereas the weak, they stutter. They don't know how to form a proper sentence, partly because they're weak. Maybe they're not educated sufficiently. They're not familiar with the terms of the discourse. Therefore, I believe it's a responsibility of all of us to attend especially to those who have hard time articulating themselves, so as to hear the voices. And I think the health of our democratic life depends on the ability of all people actually to be heard and to us to hear others. And in that way, I think the form of respect and even, I would say, neighbor love is involved in properly functioning democracy. Otherwise, people with means, people with power, end up dominating public discourse, imposing something that they see as perfectly legitimate, perfectly just upon others who suffer under that. And I believe we need to certainly attend to this, and if we don't, we won't have a democratic regime. We're going to have a plutocratic and aristocratic modes of governance under which many people will suffer.
Well, I was thinking of actually just talking about limits of political discourse or religious discourse. Actually, I can do no better than to quote Miroslav. I told you it's a great book. So he says this, right, and there are limits, right? So it says this on page 159, where he makes a clear distinction, and I love this distinction, between religious exclusivists and political exclusivists. And this is very important. So just because you're exclusively, you're exclusivist in a religious sense, doesn't prevent you from being embracing in a political sense. The danger is in political exclusivism, because that's when power structures come in, right? So this is what he says. Political exclusivists of all stripes, secular and religious, are on a collision course with one another and with the process of globalization, because these processes pull and push people of diverse faiths and secularists to live together in the same political society. Political exclusivists find this unpalatable, as they are committed to a single vision of the good life and to imposing it on all citizens. As a consequence, they assault people's dignity, perpetuate violence, and threaten the world's prosperity. Religious exclusivists who advocate political exclusivism are bad for today's world. Well, I can't do better than that. I think this is the problem. And this problem is where politics comes in, because you can, in all good faith, try to have a dialogue going, but yet get hijacked or appropriated by political forces. And this is where I told Miroslav, maybe I don't agree with you on one of these points. He says, look, one of the ways to keep on the steady path is to keep politics or political power away from religion. Well, that's kind of hard. Not if the politicians come looking for you, especially. Because religion is a very powerful tool. It's very easy to use religion to mobilize people and to inflame and to agitate. And so when you have politicians who will make use of religion, whatever the religion may be, for political purposes, then you are going to see religion distorted, right? And applied in ways which really go totally counter to what faith actually prescribes. So I think these are, limitations of human nature. And the biggest challenge in pluralist societies today is, how do we keep the politics out of this, right? Or at least keep it neutral. And I think this is where you have the biggest problem. I mean, Singapore, I think we've done it fairly okay. I think Singapore state is sometimes a little bit too interventionist, but maybe better early intervention than not. One example is inflammatory speeches or preachers saying inflammatory things. So you get a Christian pastor who denigrates the Buddhists. What happens to him?
He's invited to tea.
Yes, invited to tea by the Internal Security Department, who then advise him that maybe that's not such a great idea. By the way, we have the Internal Security Act, which allows the government to preventively detain somebody for up to 2 years without trial.
Renewable.
Longest detention was 21 years in Chiang Kai-fu. He was nothing to do with religion, but you can. So, of course, that strikes fear into your heart. You drink tea, and then I don't know whether you digest or not, but anyway, you apologize, and then you kind of make up, right? And this is another thing which I really loved about your book, about this whole question of making up, of actually reconciling, because that can only move you forward, because otherwise you'll be imprisoned by the past, right? And this is something that actually is done in a way which sometimes is quite amusing. So there was a Muslim preacher who visited Singapore, and he actually ended his sermon by saying, may Allah grant us victory over the Christians and the Jews. And somebody filmed it, actually. Eurasian guy filmed it. And he sent it to the police. And of course, this guy gets prosecuted for under the penal code for inflaming and so on. But this was not it, you see, because so what did the state do? You could just prosecute the guy, deport him, end of story. But this is not what happened. What happened then was the interreligious organization, which is an NGO in Singapore, came together. They actually went to court to support this mullah, to advise him that really, look, you made a bad mistake. He then went to the synagogue and apologized to the rabbi there. He then went and apologized to the bishop, and then everybody sort of forgave him. And then on the day he was supposed to leave Singapore, he had breakfast with the law minister. Shook hands, and he said, yes, I was wrong. This is not in the Quran. This is an old saying, Arabic saying that was very common in my village, and I just uttered that. And so the episode was brought to a close, largely through, in a way, excuse me, the heavy hand of the state, but sort of in a very sort of soft way, without just hammering somebody. So you're trying to use that as a sort of educative process as well. Now, I'm not saying that Singapore always gets it right. Sometimes you get it right, sometimes you don't get it right. But the point here is that we have adopted a model where you intervene before something blows up in your face. And as I suggested in my short talk just now, is this a good thing to always do this? Because then sensitive issues will never get raised. And every time you will check yourself, you will self-censor sometimes, and you're not going to be able to have a very serious discourse on something that may have wider implications for the public. So this is the balance and the trade-off, right?
And of course, the assumption is that the state will always be neutral, the state will always be benign.
Yeah.
But that's not the state of affairs that can be guaranteed. Just a point of correction, right? Tea actually is when you are invited by a certain political party. Coffee is when you get invited by the authorities, to have a chat with them. Yeah. So you see that wine and different beverages at different occasions. Right? Yeah. So there is a roving mic. Are there any questions that you want to raise in person? No? Okay. Yeah, if you could identify yourself, that would also be helpful.
Okay, my name is Kevin. Yeah. My question is, how willing are you to commit to democracy as an ideal once populism is the majority?
Sorry, I don't understand the second part. What do you mean populism is the majority?
Like when...
Populism is populism, majority is, yeah.
Yeah, when the populace has taken over as the majority and is probably going to win in a democratic society, are you still willing to commit to democracy as an ideal?
This is not necessarily my field of expertise, but I think I would want to yes, and not confuse populism with kind of democratic opinion formation. So that's why I would try to argue, and maybe interventionists early on who work on making sure that we have institutions that would preserve something like the deliberative forms of democracy. Otherwise, you have this high majoritarianism that imposes itself on the minority, and it's completely demoored from the values of respect for individual person, for freedom of orientation of life, not to say freedom of religion. I think you were right at the very beginning to say this is not just a matter of religion, it's a freedom of orientation of the entirety of life in whichever direction that might be as a person sees it. But so that kind of moral principles of democracy don't get eroded. Otherwise you have a bastardized form of democracy.
I will give you a lawyer's answer, which is it depends. What does it depend on? I mean, what do you mean by democracy? We can't talk about democracy in the abstract, because I think, among other things, we cannot allow majoritarianism to destroy democracy. In other words, you cannot give people the vote to destroy the vote, so to speak. Right? I think there are limits to what a democratic society requires. One of the things we do understand about democracies is that majorities are not perfect. And that's why whenever we talk about discrimination, right, sometimes I find it quite laughable in some of these human rights reports where they talk about non-discrimination for the majority, and I'm saying, why does the majority need protection? You're the majority. I mean, you really want protection for the minority. So there must be some constitutional arrangements and a common understanding, right, that exists before a democracy can function. Because if all democracy means is a majority of votes, then that's not much better than a mob. That really isn't much better than a mob. So you must have certain understandings, common understandings. You could call it a culture of democracy in order for a democracy to flourish. That's why you find some democracies work pretty well, and they tend to work well in societies where you tend to be a little bit more homogeneous. You don't have, people kind of believe the same things, have more or less the same temperament, and they don't deviate too far from each other. And there is a very good chance that the government changes. So you moderate each other. You don't make crazy promises that you can't keep because you might well be in government the next day. So there are certain requirements for democracy before it can actually work. And seriously, I think in many cases with minorities, you need, and this is the theory which I have been trying to convince Eugene about for a long, long time, which is
He was my teacher in law school.
which is a theory of the magnanimous majority. You cannot work if the majority are intent on destroying the minority. The majority must be in the position, because you are strong, much stronger, to give a little bit more. Because only in those circumstances can you keep a pluralistic society fairly stable. But anyway, that's for another.
Yeah, and of course the danger, of course, with always counting heads, is that you may be a majority under one particular count, but you may well be a minority, right? So if you think about Singapore's context, for example, right? The Buddhists are not the majority, but they are the largest religious group, right? But there are more non-Buddhists than Buddhists in Singapore, right? So this majority-minority paradigm, I think is dangerous in that sense, and so it's important that we go beyond this counting heads. So I have a friend who watches every cabinet swearing in, and he'll count the number of ministers, that affirm, and the number of ministers who swear on the Bible, because then you'll say, well, there are now a lot of Christians in the cabinet, so, or at least he says that there are so many Christians now, and so our government policy is going to be leaning towards that particular perspective. Right. So I'll take one more question from the floor. Okay, maybe I'll take these two together. Right? I know they might be on different things, but I'm just trying to move things along so that everyone has a chance to jump in.
Hi, good evening. My name is also Kevin.
How many Kevins are there?
Majority, some kind of.
Yeah, but there are more non-Kevins than Kevins in the room.
My question is to both Miroslav and Kevin. Is that what suggestions do you have as Christians to include those who are cognitively incapable of participating in public discourse? Those who are cognitively incapable of participating in public discourse on the common good, because it's in relation to Miroslav's earlier statement concerning Kant's distinction of being able to direct yourself rationally.
So Kevin, can you just elaborate a bit more on what you mean by cognitive capacity?
Maybe you are mentally retarded and you are disabled to a certain extent. You are not able to participate as most of us in this room. How do we bring a voice, hear their voices? Because if the church is supposed to be inclusive, it means it cannot be just us who are capable of walking and speaking and thinking cognitively. So what suggestions would you have for, I guess, in Miroslav's world, what theology of disability would you have for the church?
Can we move the mic to the... maybe you have that lady there, and then since we haven't, in the interest of...
Yeah.
In the interest of gender equality. Hi, thank you so much for your comments on the panel. My question is for Prof. Miroslav, but the two lawyers can weigh in on the moral component as well.
You get three different, from two lawyers you get 3 or 4 different views.
That's fine. So I wanted to go in a little bit into minority faith and what has been classified broadly as the Christian revival in Singapore. And I refer to the census, the last census that was conducted in Singapore that showed a very high rise in conversion to Christianity and specifically to Catholicism. And when I say Christianity, I'm speaking about the mega churches, and then obviously with Catholicism, it's the traditional Roman Catholic faith. So I wanted to get your assessment on what do you think the factors are in our society that are leading to these changes in commitment to faith, irregardless of if it's conversion from agnostics to Christians or what have you.
Thank you. My name is Timothy, so this question is open to the panel. I guess my question is about what is the role and type arguments that are made from a religious perspective in public debate. What I mean by that is, say consider the issue of gay marriage and whether that should be legalized in society. I want to suggest that there are at least two types of arguments that a religious person might put forth. The first might be publicly defined, so the person might argue that conjugal marriages between a man and woman are optimal because they are the best for fostering children. See. The second type of argument would be of a more religious character. It may suggest, well, we start from the premise that there's a God and the biblical scriptures are correct, and therefore, because in scripture it suggests that homosexual acts are considered sin, therefore that is wrong, and therefore, and on that basis, gay marriage should not be legalized or should not be obtained in society because it's not good for human flourishing, say, but based on premises within biblical scripture, which only as Christians believe. What is the role of those arguments? And are both of those, should both of those be admissible? And in fact, should the latter type of argument, what sort of weight should that have in a pluralistic society?
Questions? Is there on that?
Bringing the four of them together.
Okay.
My question is four of them together.
Can you introduce yourself very quickly?
Okay, John here. Okay, earlier on, remember our questionnaire that mentioned about hearing the cognitively incapable. Okay, let me put it this way also. When he mentioned about the gay marriage, so I'm thinking into like in the Singapore context, even though the churches are not the majority, the Christians are not the majority, but in terms of the voice, they are the loudest. Because, for example, the Buddhists will hardly say anything on, say, not about gay marriage, but about homosexuality, for example. But usually the churches are the one that came out to make a stance. So what is the purpose of such a public discourse? Is it to try to influence the government to adopt policies that are favorable to our, let's say, Christian stance? How about giving a voice to the others? For example, in this case, let's say talking about homosexuality or homosexuals who are not very organized other than being dogged. Okay. So would the churches consider in their public discourse to say that, hey, we should give a space to these others too, even though we disagree with their view? That means to say that the churches will also come together and tell them, hey, we should repeal Section 377A, that is the criminalizing this, same gender sex. So this is how I was trying to link this together. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to turn the floor back to Kevin and Miroslav. You won't have to answer. You don't have to answer every question, but I hope that every question will pose, one of you will take it up. So let's begin with Kevin's question about cognitive capacity.
I think the response should be relatively simple. Those who are close to them, those who understand their plight, who attend to their needs, should be also their spokesperson. Should bring their concerns into the public domain. Give voice to those who don't have it.
Okay. Kevin, do you have any thoughts about the revivalism?
Wow.
I don't know. I'm from the Catholic Church. What they call a cradle Catholic, right? So baptized as an infant. As far as I know, the Catholic Church is concerned about the number of that there are not enough new Catholics. When you go to the churches, you see it's actually the foreign communities, that are attending masses in the Catholic churches. I think that's a concern of the Catholic Archdiocese here. Any thoughts about the
Well, I think if first of all, I think that generally there is a greater resurgence of religiosity all around. Okay, and as we have a society that, you know, very stressful, people are looking for an alternative answer, looking for something to plug their faith in. And so it could well be any religion. It could well be any religion. But I think that both the Christians and the Catholics have been the ones who have been able to tap into this and to capitalize on it. Whether it's because they have better organized activities or ministries or outreach programs, particularly with the youth. I mean, I know a number of people who, young people actually, who volunteer in a number of these Catholic groups, outreach groups and so on, and they've been very, very active. Not so years ago, but these days you actually see a lot more of them. So it's really a question of who is out there trying to recruit members. And so maybe that's what we are seeing, and that's why you see, you know, what you call a Christian resurgence. I'm just guessing. I'm not, you know, I haven't done any anthropological research on this, but this is the sense that I get, that actually the churches are very active. And so, well, sure, if there are people looking for faith, you catch them. I mean, yeah.
I mean, there is that religious market. Some scholars would call it, right? You know that there is a market, and you believe that your product is good. You would want to, you know, to sell it. You know, again, I'm speaking in advertising terms. But let's turn to Timothy's question about, you know, gay marriages and, you know, and how, you know, different arguments, you know, could be used. And I think this is also, maybe this is a point where I could introduce, you know, questions that deal with, you know, the point about mutual respect. But how do you have mutual respect if people start from entirely, fundamentally different premises, right? So if we talk about gay marriages, you know, I think generally, you know, Christianity would say, well, you know, that's something which we should try to resist. You know, but then you do have views from other segments, you know, where they say, well, you know, if two people love each other, why not? Now, I've deliberately not used labels, right? Because I find labels very, very problematic, right? You know, so we tend to say, oh, the conservatives, you know, they oppose gay marriage. I'm not sure that that's in the Singapore context a very accurate view.
But that's not what Timothy was asking.
Yes, but I'm linking
because he's asking about the validity of the kinds of arguments you would make. Whether an argument that's based on faith is one that is relevant. Am I correct? I'm trying to understand. Yeah. The one that is relevant, powerful, or even relevant or useful in the public sphere, or should one not use religious arguments but use some other arguments? I think that was the question, which is actually right up your alley. This is what you've been reading, right? I'm sorry, Eugene.
I'll come to the point about different premises and what.
No, I think it's a very important question. It's a hotly debated question, and it concerns the very character of something like liberal democracy. There are the so-called public reason liberals, right, to which the argument is only reasons that are accessible to the entirety of the population are admissible, especially admissible for the formation of legislation that is going to impact everyone. So that then reasons that are derived from a particular traditions, whatever that particular tradition might be of whatever religious convictions, would not be admissible into the public debate. They may have that motivation and reasons for themselves in private, but in the public domain, the only public reasons function. Now, I myself do not subscribe to that position. Some of the best stuff that I've read on this comes from a Christian philosopher by the name of Nicholas Walterstorff, and his critique of Rawlsian type of political liberalism. And I am persuaded by Nick Walterstorff that every person in liberal democracies or in the democracies that can be Christianly properly justified has equal voice, and that every person can speak in their own voice, that there is in fact no such a thing as kind of neutral public reason, that all reason is always situated so that reasons coming from scripture, coming from tradition, can be brought into public debate. Now that's countering the long tradition, although going all the way to John Locke and culminating in some way in John Rawls. I think the question that comes next, so let's say the reasons, any reasons are admissible in public debate. Reasons, they're your reasons, you can bring them up. But that's a slightly different question than the rhetorical question. Which reasons are going to have effect in forming public opinion? Right. And in the public life, you cannot think simply of the stringency of your reason. You have to think about persuasiveness of your reason for broad swaths of whoever it is that you want to persuade. And then you have to ask the question, what reasons are most suited for the purpose that I have? I think it's very important to distinguish rhetorical usefulness and permissibility. And I am for obviously tailoring public discussion rhetorically, but I am also for being able to bring to bear reasons from your tradition. What will, after all, what will a pious Jew do? Then go back to Torah and the sources of the tradition. What will a pious Christian do? Entirety rests of their position rests on the foundation of this revelation. So is it with Muslim, and so it is without some other religious tradition. That seems to be only sensible way to have a pluralistic democracy, because otherwise you've already kind of stripped them of their religious, particularly religious belonging, and then allow them to be some kind of generic human beings in public debate.
Miroslav, do you think that if someone is speaking from a particular religious or faith perspective, that the person should be upfront about it, or or is the person entitled to couch it in universal terms, or in the words you use, make it persuasive?
I think people are allowed to use any reasons that they seem, that would seem reasonable to people, right? So it would seem that would seem to me. Now, whether that may be slightly different, then does a person somehow have an obligation to identify themselves as belonging, coming from a certain standpoint? I don't know what to think about it. For instance, I teach at Yale a course called Life Worth Living, which is a kind of pluralistic exploration of the purposes of our lives based on the great religious tradition. When I teach that, I always start the class by saying, perspective from which I come. I tell them, this is who I am, this is what I believe. In this class, we're going to be wrestling from about these issues. For you to know where I come from in this pedagogical situation, here are my cards. I invite all of you to say the same of yourself if you wish and are comfortable to do so. But I'll let the students either say or not say. They can be who they want to be in that debate. Does that apply to broader public? What do you think? I don't know what to think.
We had this discussion.
Yes, and being the practical lawyer, I say it depends. No, I'm serious. I'm really quite serious about this, because look, it depends on who you're trying to persuade, and the purpose for your speaking. Now, if you want to go out there and make a statement about who you are and what religion what faith you abide by, and what that position is, then you should state it as it is. But if you are just trying to advance a policy, trying to push things along in a particular direction, I think you've got to look at your audience and say, well, if I reveal my faith, is it going to jeopardize this thing? And the people are just going to turn off their ears because they heard that I'm a Christian or a Muslim or whatever it is. In which case I say, well then don't say, just give them the view, right? So I mean, it's strategy. There's no particular principle attached to this. I don't feel very strongly that, oh, you're actually hiding. It's actually a hidden agenda by these Christians or something like that. No, I don't think you should think like that. I think you've got to look at who your audience is. And of course, I mean, in discourse, the first negative thing is you never insult your audience, right? So you try and say things that will not upset people if you are trying to persuade.
Yeah.
The key about persuasion is to get people humming and saying, yeah, right. Right, not like, wow. Practical answer, really.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Imran?
Thank you. My name is Imran. Just want to continue from the last point of Kevin. I think we get the drift that the discussion is moving towards advocating for more pluralistic, democratic, robust kind of public discourse. But of course, the public comprises of different levels of people and with different reasoning categories, etc. And if we go by the lowest common denominator, we will definitely find people who are not able to engage in the discourse of this type, for example, in a rational, civil manner. And my question is, how then do we deal something like the issue of religious offense? Because there will be someone somewhere who will be offended by anything and everything. And if we go by the legislation of wounding religious feeling, and therefore the most sensible thing for any authority to do is to quell the kind of sentiment that is bubbling up as a result of mobilization of people along the idea that I'm offended and therefore I want to curtail the freedom of expression of that other person that purportedly is offending me. And this has been the case in many countries where religious populism and politics get entangled and intertwined, and even politicians are now playing up this issue of religious offense in order to maintain status quo or to push a certain agenda. So how then do we deal with this idea of religious offense while wanting a robust, pluralistic, democratic public discourse? Thank you.
Okay. I mean, certainly, in the Singapore context, I think one can say that, that there is no right to offend. But I think your question is directed at, is there a right not to be offended? Yes.
I think there is no real answer to that, simply because it depends on the audience that you are dealing with. And what needs to be done, I think, is two-pronged. One is that you try to have serious engagements in settings like this, where it's in a way self-selecting, where you get people who really want to engage. And then you can be a lot more open about the discussions that we have. And people are not going to go away thinking that, okay, somebody came with the intention to insult me or whatever it is. The bigger and wider the public is that you're dealing with, the harder it's going to be. And you never know what the reaction is. And I'm reminded of a really funny incident that happened. Well, it wasn't an incident, but it was a series of incidents that happened in Singapore some years ago. And I'm looking at the audience, you all look too young to probably even know this. Quite some years ago, I think it was 1992 or 1993, the censorship committee reviews of censorship laws every 10 years. And this one was under the chairmanship of Tommy Koh, and it was actually quite liberal. And they thought, it's time for us to liberalize our film ratings, right? So rather than just have, and in those days there was just G and G. I think there was just G. So you got to scrutinize all. It was all Disney, sort of thing. And they studied other countries' rating systems, and they thought, all right, Singapore is ready now, and we will have R18. No, R18, it was R18. So what happened? Well, of course, we never had anything other than G, so R18 suddenly, you were getting this flood of movies coming in, right? Not terribly fantastic movies, but there were all these what they call Cat C movies, or Cat 3 movies, Amy Yip movies, Hong Kong sort of movies.
They wouldn't know who Amy Yip is.
Rather voluptuous Hong Kong actress. Doesn't act in the most arty film like that. Well, anyhow, the proliferation of these movies coming in, right? And they were flooding the cinemas. And there was a backlash. Now, those of us who were younger then, we said, hey, great, we can now have more variety of movies and so on and so forth. But the backlash was quite serious. Many Singaporeans, they call them the heartlanders. I don't like this heartlanders thing because it's like, oh, Singapore is heartland, right? So the heartlanders, all right? And basically they were mainly middle-aged women living in the public housing estates who were probably very upset that their husbands were all lining up for aliens. Basically told the government, we don't want this smut in our backyard. But it was a rather sophisticated protest. It's not that we don't want liberalization of film. You can show this in Orchard Road, you know, in the city, but not in the HDB estate. Don't got children around. You shouldn't do this. And the government rolled back. And suddenly they revised it, and then it became R21. So they raised it by 3 years. They said, well, that's not much help. These guys are 45 years old. Not very helpful. Then they said, okay, let's have RA21. Must be artistic. So suddenly no more Amy Yip. And then you had art house films, and you had, Milan Kundera, and that sort of movies. But what I'm saying here is this, right? You sometimes cannot be accurate in your pulse, putting your pulse on what the public really thinks. And so you need, as I said, two things. One, you should have more selective forums, and you should have more of them, because at least more people have a chance to get engaged. Second thing, you need more and more education. You really have, and really education is your key, and that's why I think I'm still happy to still be in education after all these years, because this is the way you can change the way people think. It's very slow, it's very frustrating, but it does have a longer lasting effect. And then people will not be so easily swayed by the next, charismatic guy who comes around. Well, come on, that's fluff, or that's just inciting us. Right? So I think you need it to go hand in hand as a society matures. And I think that's what's needed. Thanks.
Okay, we're running out of time, so I just have one question which I want to pose to both Miroslav and Kevin. So I think that, in a way, this is an audience of converted, right? So we all agree that faith does have a role, a voice to play in a pluralistic society. But I just want to push each of you to consider, whether there's a point of contention between the two of you, right? So yes, you agree that there is a voice, but the question of methods, are there methods which can be resorted to, or are there methods which cannot be resorted to? I think one of the concerns is, if we all agree that religion does have a role to play, why is it that there are still concerns, about the role of faith in the public square?
think some of the concerns of the role of public faith are the ones we've discussed earlier about public versus tradition-based reason, and a sense that if some folks bring their own traditions to bear to public debate, they're going to foist something on somebody else that they feel is not reasonable, not appropriate. So the fear of imposition, I think, is quite there, is present. I think So what we've been discussing now, let me back up a little bit, is need for faith-friendly democracy. But we need also democracy-friendly faiths, right? So there is a kind of political philosophy side and legal side, institutional side, but there is a kind of religious side to this as well. It's not clear to me that religious traditions have on the whole been friendly to pluralistic democratic opinion formation. So that there has been, whether that's in the Christian tradition, just think of place of freedom of religion in the Catholic tradition, in the Christian tradition, all the way in the Catholic tradition was until the 60s that the freedom of religion was first actively formulated and embraced by the church, right? And that's not a particularly egregious example. Catholic Church has been generally quite good in thinking about some of these issues. But definitely there is a question of inner transformations of faith, where faith is not something that claims all the loyalties of and imposes itself on the entire population. And I think that is a fear, and I think in some cases it's a legitimate fear, and it needs internal religious transformation. We've talked about this question, and maybe I shouldn't say that in Singapore, given the kind of laws that you have. But I don't believe that we have right not to be offended. I don't think that right is enforceable at all. I believe that we have strong obligation not to offend, right? So it goes the other way around. But you can have religious traditions in which we need to kind of sensitize, whether that's Christians when somebody talks in an unacceptable way about Jesus Christ or Virgin Mary, or whether that's Muslims that who when somebody talks about in an acceptable way about the Quran. That to me is a kind of obligation to educate internally religious traditions in order not to grow a little bit thicker skin in the pluralistic societies. Otherwise, we will not be able to have genuine open discourse. And that's just one smidgen of the growth that religious tradition needs to undergo in order to be able to participate in the environment of pluralism in contemporary world.
Yeah. Well, I think the biggest problem and challenge with I mean, I don't think there's anything that you can't really bring to the table in terms of discussion. I totally agree with Miroslav that actually you need an environment where this is possible. One big challenge, and this is actually emerging from a piece that I'm currently trying to finish. It's taken me too long, looking at the evolution of religious freedom in Asia, from both a sort of legal and historical point of view. And what you see in patterns is that lots of, at different points in history, relative tolerance of religion, then persecution. And there was this great hope, in fact, in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, where there was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where everybody started talking about religious freedom, and began to be embedded into various constitutions. But this did not last very long, because within a few years, you began to see exclusivism, political and religious exclusivism taking over, where you begin to embed into the constitution official religions, privileging one religion over another religion. And so when states get involved, right, then it becomes a much bigger problem than a question of faith, because a challenge to any religious dictum is also a challenge against political power. And that would be a far greater objective or motivation to crush you than a religious doctrine.
So, the timekeeper says, time out. It's a nice way of saying, I should wrap it up. I want to thank all of you for your very keen participation, and there were many questions that you have used the QR code to put across, but in 45 minutes it's very hard to address all of them. But I hope you have got a sense of the insight, the thoughts, the scholarship of both Miroslav and Kevin, on the various issues relating to faith in a pluralistic society. I think in Singapore, there is certainly a wide degree of religious freedom. I wouldn't say that we are in a perfect state. But every year I work with an evangelical Christian organization in the US, known as Institute of Global Engagement. And on some of these programs on religion and rule of law, we tie up with Brigham Young University, right? A Church of the Latter-day Saints. And so the idea is to go around trying to engage with government officials in what they call state cases, where we try to give them, where we give lectures on the value of religious freedom, right? So over the years, we have regular programs in Vietnam and Laos. Myanmar was going well until the recent troubles, but it's also taken us to Kazakhstan, Nepal, and in Indonesia. And one of the things that struck me was, in Singapore, I think, when we go to places of worship, we take it for granted, right? But in many of these in many other societies, sometimes going to a place of worship could be a very dangerous engagement, and so I'm always concerned about labels, because even though the IGE describes themselves as an evangelical Christian organization, they do not. There is no evangelism that I could see. I think they really go by the examples that they set. And so I hope that, I'm very delighted that Veritas Forum has come to Singapore. There are many issues that we didn't get to discuss, on the topic of faith in a pluralistic society. But I hope, we all appreciate that we do have a role to play in not just, trying to have a better understanding of our own faith, but also, the importance of interfaith engagement, the importance of, trying to appreciate where the other person is coming from. Now, to me that's important, right? Because you don't have to agree or accept where the other person is coming from. But I think it's important to at least try to recognize and appreciate their concerns, their interests or their fears. Because I think we have something here which is really precious. And the lack of religious freedom for any one particular segment of society, will ultimately affect those of us who enjoy religious freedom. So on that note, can I just can I request that you give Kevin and Miroslav a round of applause?